to the floor to continue the case for the negative team. The second speaker, Paul.
Mr. Speaker, the problem with this model is that by creating these islands of sovereignty, they are undermining development for everybody else. But also, by creating these islands of sovereignty, they are privileging the economic wealth of the people that they think would be better off living there, rather than their human rights and their way that they can improve themselves. Because we think that, the people suffering under poor labour standards in a Dickensian sweatshop did not look to their employers and perfect competition to give them their human rights. It was ultimately the state that was able to grant those things, and it's the state that is attacked by the affirmative team's model in today's debate. Let's look at three issues. Firstly, economic benefits. Secondly, accountability. Thirdly, second speaker material about comparative advantage. So firstly, to economic benefits. And we heard that we need to create these these islands with sovereignty because there's so much high risk that no one else will want to invest in these countries without real control. Well, we think when they told us that investors wanted real control, that was a concession that that's going to lead to real exploitation. Because part of the reason that transnational corporations are rushing to the third world at the moment is in a race to the bottom to create sweatshops and a race to the bottom to exploit environmental resources as quickly as possible. So we think that's the kind of control that they would be after. But we think that in terms of reducing the sovereign risk, the affirmative team's model isn't even good for that, because it's going to be very hard to control these islands of sovereignty when they are creating resentment between the people in the rest of the state and these parcels of the state that they've sold off. And in fact, they're exacerbating the sovereign risk by creating perceptions that the state is useless, that they had to circumvent the state, and that the state can't ever provide proper standards and we need to circumvent them. And that's particularly harmful because we think the rest of people are still going to be stuck behind in that state. The majority of people will suffer that. But then we heard that we need to create these islands of sovereignty in order to create infrastructure. We think that there is burgeoning development and investment in Asia and Africa at the moment because it is crazy to be leaving resources like oil in the ground under the status quo, and that infrastructure is being built, which is why we've seen that some of the highest rates of growth have been in the developing world recently, like Mozambique, China, and Angola. What we would say is that this model is therefore unnecessary, and by parceling these areas of sovereignty off, you're just going to be reducing the benefits of people's own natural resources when it just gets taken away as private profit rather than as tax revenue as it does under the status quo when we encourage development through the state. They've told us that there would be a transfer of skills. We say that entrepreneurs go to the third world under the status quo. And then they told us that there would be a huge cash injection which would allow for development of the rest of the state. We'd say, what value is that cash injection going to be? It's either going to be very low because you're selling them useless land, or it's going to be very high but detrimental because in order to make the value high, you have to promise them things like that they can breach labour and environmental standards or steal water from the rest of the country to make these islands viable, as we heard from the first affirmative. Second thing in rebuttal, accountability. We think that the incentive to keep workers happy just isn't enough in today's debate because there is a high supply of low-skilled labour in these countries. People are incredibly replaceable, so we don't think that they're going to have much choice in this situation. And by undermining foreign direct investment in the rest of the country, they will in fact have even less choice. Then we heard that, well, if they have a poor record, nobody will want to sell to them again. Well, if the governments of these countries are as bad as the affirmative team keeps telling us, they will keep selling to companies regardless of how bad their records are. They'll probably just increase the price and not the standards that are imposed on those people at all. Lastly, we heard that this model is great because it prevents the corporations blaming authoritarian regimes for the standards in those countries. When have we accepted that as an excuse under the status quo? We think that you can just enforce those standards, and the transnational corporations are complicit with bad governments is not an excuse, and we do not accept. But if these governments are as bad as the affirmative team says, we think it's ironic that they're relying on these governments to be the ones that enforce these contracts, that it's going to be the military that's going to be busting in whenever they think that environmental or labour standards have been breached. That was a massive contradiction in their case. relying on those states to control those standards was never going to work. The third issue I want to look at in rebuttal is the second speaker material about the current lack of comparative advantage. We think that a lot of this material was almost entirely contingent, that things were going to improve in those states. Secondly, we would say that there is already competition, and that you don't have to also parcel off sovereignty in order to create competition between firms in the third world. But lastly, we would say that when the options on the table are either work in a sweatshop or work in an island of sovereignty where you can't guarantee those standards, we think that makes sweatshops in the rest of that country all the more likely in today's debate. What am I going to tell you in substantive material? Firstly, I'm going to tell you what this does for the relationship between the developing world and the developed, and secondly, what it does with individual identification with the corporation. So firstly, the developing world and the developed. And we'd say that the developed world have stronger democratic institutions, are accountable to their domestic electorates to improve living standards, not just in their own country, but also the third world, and want to engage developing world countries in multilateral processes. What we think happens with this team's model is that those things are attacked. Firstly, because this provides an excuse to developed world governments to not increase their aid contributions to the developing world. The American governments can say, don't worry, American entrepreneurs are on it, and the American dream is being spread that way to the developing world. And then their aid budget will not increase. And we've seen that there's been pressure in the GFC to not increase those aid budgets, and that will just get worse under the affirmative team's model. The reason why that is particularly bad is that 0.7 GDP, as has been promised, from all the world's rich countries, adds up to a lot more aid and investment than parceling off the shittiest bits of countries and selling it to entrepreneurs does. So attacking the global consensus for aid to the developing world is going to be particularly harmful when you don't have the benefits of that aid coming in. Secondly, we would say that this results in a lack of leverage of the developed world over the developing, because you can't put conditions on aid for better governance and for respecting property rights and that sort of thing. If bad developing world countries can just make their money another way, a quicker, cheaper and easier way, by just parceling off and selling bits of their country out from under their poor citizens. So because we won't be able to have that mechanism of leverage, the developed world won't be able to improve that country. Thirdly, we would say that multilateralism is attacked by this, because there'll be less international cooperation when economic development is increasingly happening in these small islands of sovereignty. Last argument I want to look at is about what this does for individual identification with the corporation. We'd say that this model results in cultural propaganda, where identification with the corporation, rather than your fellow man, or rather than with this state, is encouraged. Why is that bad? Firstly, because it will mean that people are less likely to properly consider their options, because they won't consider moving back, because they will identify more with the corporation rather than with the people in the rest of the state, and rather with the state itself. Secondly, it harms the rights of others, because the first affirmative told us that these weren't proper states, that they had diverse clashing ethnic groups. But we think that this will result in decreased empathy for other people, and that people in these statelets will not be insisting on the rights of the people that they've left behind. So because we think that this harms the people that are left behind, but also that these are islands devoid of accountability that will just exploit their workers and their environment, we beg to oppose.